Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Ramarowski. I'm the Executive Director of ASMIA and SPME, and it is my pleasure to welcome you back to our webinar series. This is our first beginning of the fall slash end of the summer show, so we're happy to be back. And we're happy to host this afternoon my good friend and colleague, Simon Waldman. Simon is a longtime friend, also a byproduct and also as someone who's affiliated with King's College, which is where I was trained. So it's great to have him on the show. Simon has been doing a lot of work for the past few years now on Turkey and has spent time diving into the dynamics of the Jewish community in Turkey. And his newest book really is about between nationalism and Islamism, and really how Turkey failed its Jews. And that's the topic of his talk. But the topic of the book is looking elsewhere, the Jews in Turkey then and now. Highly recommended to dive into it. There's much that we talk about today as it relates to Turkey and Turkey's involvement as it relates to Turkish-Israel relations post 10/7. But I know Simon will talk about the historical origins of all of this and maybe get into the contemporary, and we could tackle it from there. So housekeeping wise, Simon will talk for about 30 minutes or so. Then we'll go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat. All you have to do is type in your questions, and we will do our best to get to them. As always, I apologize in advance if we don't get to your questions. Feel free to write us after the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond in a timely fashion. So really, without further ado, Simon, welcome to the webinar, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Asaf. Always very good to be introduced. I like being introduced. It doesn't happen very often when I teach on a weekly basis. No one introduces me. I have to introduce myself, and that's absolutely fine and wonderful. Thank you, Asaf, for inviting me. Thank you, Alex, Susan, and Emily for your help in all the logistics work and behind the scenes work. So I'm here obviously to talk to you and to also to plug my book. I'll get in so much trouble with my publisher if I don't. It's called Looking for Elsewhere, The Jews of Turkey, Then and Now. And in this book, I'm asking a question. I'm asking a question of how did a community of around 85,000 when the Republic was established in 1923 and the first census of 1927, go from 85,000, a large community, into such a small community that it is today, around 12,000. If you really want to be liberal about it and you want to be generous, you could possibly extend that to around 15,000. And if you want to be conservative, it would perhaps dip a little bit lower. Why is that the case? And that brings me to the kind of the topic of the discussion today between nationalism and Islamism. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about a lot of the nationalism part today for about maybe 20 minutes. And I'm going to talk about for maybe 10 minutes the Islamism part, the more recent part, perhaps the aspect of this topic that you're more familiar with. But it's still asking that same question. How did a large community go to such a small community? And that, of course, was never inevitable. So when it comes to nationalism, I was very much inspired by Elie Kaddouri. Elie Kaddouri was a kind of a scholar that around the third year of my undergraduate degree, I kind of discovered, and it kind of got me really interested in the Middle East, nationalism, these kind of different questions. Really kind of shaped, I guess, my academic trajectory for better or for worse. And his book, Nationalism, which was written, 1960, 1961, around that time, so a long time ago, still resonates for me today. And one of the points that he was making is not just that nationalism is a recent phenomenon, but that it was also a very divisive and a nefarious ideology that swept into the fore towards the early part of the 19th century. So very recent, and this divided people from each other, caused a lot of harm as opposed to good. And when you look at it from the perspective of the late Ottoman Empire and the different communities that were part of this multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, and what happened in the Turkish Republic, you get a few examples of what perhaps Elie Kaddouri was talking about. But at the same time, there is an argument that one can make about nationalism that it doesn't necessarily divide people. It can also bring different groups together into one potential cause. It's interesting towards the end of the Ottoman Empire and the beginning of the Republic of Turkey, which was established in 1923, that this was a multi-ethnic state that soon became established. There was the inclusivity of lots of different ethnic groups, people from the Balkans, from Bulgaria, the last community around the Black Sea were all incorporated into the national fabric, while others were excluded, think Greeks, Armenians. And that begs the question, what about the Jews? Were they included or excluded? If excluded, why excluded? And if included, why included? And it's really part of my thinking of why were they not included into the national fold? Why did those numbers reduce as opposed to expand? And I'm kind of inspired by a recent trip that I made to Israel, which was associated with Tel Aviv University. We spoke to many people from the Druze community. And it was really interesting that we heard from Jewish Zionist politicians talking about the Jewish community as if they were blood brothers. And we heard, and it was under Chatham House rule, so I don't want to say, we heard Jewish politicians talk about the Israeli state and Zionism. And if I would close my eyes and be told that this was a right-wing Jewish nationalist speaking, I would have believed them. This is coming from the mouth of a Jewish politician. So in many respects, they were included into the nationalist fold, given something just beyond mere citizenship. And I'm wondering, why was that not the case with the Jews of the Ottoman Empire? And just to add a little bit more into that kind of question, when you look at the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the threat of Russia, the threat of nationalist forces emerging in the Balkans and in other places, and the economic, decline of the Ottoman Empire, the Jews suffered just as much as the Muslim Turks did. And then, if you want to take this a little bit further, from 1909 onwards, Jews were increasingly conscripted into the Ottoman Empire. In other words, they were fighting in the Ottoman military alongside their Muslim brethren. So I have a chapter in my book about Gallipoli, about the Dardanelles Straits. This is kind of World War I, and this is something which is a very fascinating kind of time in history. And I initially approached it from the perspective of looking at what took place from the other side, from the Zion Mule Corps. This was the kind of the forerunner of the Jewish Legion. This is a kind of a Jewish auxiliary force which was established under the British and was led by Colonel Patterson, who later became very close with Benzion Netanyahu, the father of Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel. And this Zion Mule Force is very interesting and of course it's very fascinating. It's fascinated many people. It's almost a who's who of the Zionist movement when you kind of look at it from left and right. Ben Gurion was part of it, Joseph Trumpeldor, Zev Jabotinsky, he was a part of it. So I wanted to examine it from there. And then I had an interview with a Turkish researcher called Martin Delevi. He said he was interested in coming to this talk. So if he's there, hi. If not, hopefully you get a kind of a recording, or we'll talk about this after. And he was interesting because he made an exhibition. He created an exhibition about Jews in the Ottoman military. So we had a kind of a discussion. And in it, he said, oh, if someone approaches World War I from the perspective of the Zion Mule Corps while looking at the Jews in Turkey, they'll be way off. And I was then, kind of like sinking in my seat thinking, oh God, that's exactly what I've done. But Metin was kind enough to give me and to send me the content of his exhibition and all the kind of the photographs and the accounts and the diary entries and the memoirs. And this was incredible. It's a treasure trove. And what I saw from this, looking at picture after picture, photograph after photograph, account after account, was that there were many Jews who fought and died for the Ottoman Empire. So when Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, during the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, said to his forces, I'm not asking you to fight for me, I'm ordering you to die for me, he was talking to Jewish soldiers as well. And in one of the memoirs, which I paraphrase in my book, which I explain for a page and a half or so, there's one a Jewish Ottoman soldier. His name is Moyes, and he recalls that he was fighting along with two of his Jewish comrades, and there were mortar shells going flying left and right. One of his Jewish comrades fell on top of him, and he had to lift him up as if at first he thought he was dazed and confused. He thought it was a huge rock or a boulder, and he found out it was the body of his dead Jewish comrade. And then his other Jewish comrade, he was shouting out, saying, "Where are you? Where are you? I can't see." And he didn't realize that it wasn't mud that he was wiping from his eyes. It was blood. He had lost his sight completely. And Moyes managed to survive and to record the memory. And basically what this highlights is that Jews could have been, should have been, arguably part of the national fabric of the Turkish Republic, which of course begs the question as to why. So when I started doing the book, I started also interviewing people, and I kind of played dumb a little bit, if that makes sense. Every time somebody told me about the Elsa Niego affair, I would kind of respond like, "Oh, why was that important?" Right? I already had an inkling, of course, but I wanted to hear it from people's mouths themselves. Now, this is an important development which happened in 1927, so just 4 years after the Turkish Republic was established. And it might sound like a Me Too story, and it is a Me Too story if we kind of like think about it in the kind of modern era. And this is a story of a young Jewish woman. Different accounts put her age differently. Some say she was 20, others 18, others 19. But it's a young Jewish woman who lives in Istanbul. She lives in around the Galata neighborhood. And there is a former Ottoman official, he's about 20 or 30 years her senior, who falls absolutely, totally in love with her. He's already married, but he totally falls in love with her, and he asks for her hand in marriage, which she refuses. Then he asks again, and then he approaches her parents. And again, there's a refusal after refusal after refusal. He starts stalking her, following her, appearing up in all these kind of weird places. You've heard the story before. When he learns that Elsa Niego is to be betrothed, she's promised her hand to somebody else, he takes a knife, and in the middle of a crowded street in Istanbul, the financial district actually, not too far away from Galata, it's actually there's a really nice library where I researched some of my book actually in that very street called Salt Galata. There was a former bank. In this financial district, very crowded, he stabs her in the neck, some say slit her throat, and kills her. So this is, of course, very tragic. And when it's her funeral the following day, it turns into a protest of sorts. There are local Jews who are demanding justice. And even though the Ottoman official, the former Ottoman official, is arrested, so are those who are protesting. In fact, they are not just arrested, they're also detained, they're denied bail. And overall, they spend a good 30 to 33 days in jail. Meanwhile, the press runs rampant about how Jews are engaging in dual loyalty, how they're not appreciative of the Republic, of how, in other words, they're showing ingratitude. Now, this is really serious, and this is a turning point within the community. It's a turning point for several reasons. One was that this is the period of different reforms that were taking place within the Turkish Republic. Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, has abolished the caliphate. He's abolished the sultanate. He's declared a republic. He's changed. By this time, the hat law has been put into place. So instead of the fez, it's Western-style hats. The calendars have changed. And very, very importantly, in this case, in 1926, the civic code has changed to emulate the Swiss civic code, which grants women rights of inheritance, in marriage, in divorce, of those sorts of things. So in many respects, the young Elsa Niego is a victim of someone who is going against these very new-founded rights which have been given to the citizenship. And those who are doing the protesting, are essentially as Turkish citizens calling for the civic law which Kemal Ataturk has put into place to be enforced. and they find themselves arrested, imprisoned, and victimized in the press. And for many within the Jewish community of Turkey, this ushers in a period of kayades, which is a kind of a Ladino term for being discreet. You can be a Turkish citizen, but do not be outwardly Jewish, as that could cause problems for you. And this in itself is difficult. Now, I just said a Ladino term because it's important to realize when I say Ladino, some people call it Judeo-Spanish. This is the lingua franca of many Jews of Turkey. The majority, not all, but the majority of Jews from Turkey came to the Ottoman Empire on the invitation of Bayezid II, the Sultan who came after Mehmed the Conqueror, to kind of redevelop the empire. And this came just after the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula. Not all Jews from Turkey trace their origin there, but the majority do. Some claim ancestry from the Byzantine period, and there's other, especially those from originating from the southeast of the country, who claim a different ancestry and more of a Mizrahi origin. So this is really interesting, though, and it's important. And the reason why I mention it is for many Jews, their mother tongue is Judeo-Spanish, it is Ladino. And just immediately after this affair of this young Jewish woman being murdered and those who are protesting it, calling for justice to happen, are victimized, just 1 year later, there is the Citizens Speak Turkish campaign. Now, going back to Eddie Kadori, my favorite historian of ideas, one of the things that he argues in nationalism is that language was often seen as a kind of an extension of race, especially in a European context. And I think that could be expanded to a Turkish context as well, because it was very much seen that to be part of the Turkish nation, one has to speak Turkish. So what is one to do when a community does not speak Turkish? And that ushered in 1928, which lasted all the way into the 1930s, the Citizens Speak Turkish campaign, where those who were found to be speaking a language other than Turkish, whether that be Ladino, whether that be Greek, whether that be Laz or Kurdish, were then humiliated in the street, told to speak Turkish, sometimes assaulted, sometimes arrested. And in other words, in public life, one has to speak Turkish in order to be part of the Turkish nation, in order to get full citizenship. But then there's, of course, a problem. And one is that it takes a long time to adapt a new language. And even if one does know how to speak the language, there is, of course, accents. And very much it was the case that Jews were speaking Turkish accented, which kind of created this kind of aura that they were somehow different, not quite the same. So the Citizens Speak Turkish campaign plays a part there, but there's another pull, and that is an identity associated with a nominal Islam, right? So even though the Turkish state at this time is very much secular, Islam is still an important identity marker of what it meant to be Turkish, just expressing cultural terms, right? So the idea of one who is part of Turkish culture, it's the origin of a nominal Islamic identity. It didn't mean that you go and pray 5 times a day or you go to mosque on Fridays, but your roots is that of a Muslim identity. It kind of harkens back to the Ottoman times. This becomes important as we enter the period of the 1930s, especially 1934. In the Turkish parliament, a law is passed, the resettlement law, which looks at specific parts of Turkey, especially those which are strategically important, the Dardanelles Straits. Thrace is the part of, if you imagine Turkey today, Thrace is the part which is in Europe. It's that small part which is in Europe. These are strategically important, especially when you consider relations with Bulgaria or Greece, and the importance of making sure, from the perspective of the Turkish nationalists, that these areas are populated predominantly by full Turks, rather than potential fifth colonists. And the idea is that you can resettle, and that in these particular areas, it has to be majority, quote unquote, Turkish. And by that, it did not mean Jewish. At the same time, as this resettlement law, you have different press reports, intellectuals within particular regions, in a place called Çanakkale, which is just across from the Dardanelles, and also in Thrace, in cities like Edirne and other places, increasing articles that are derogatory against Jews. Soon there is attacks against Jewish communities in what has been called the Thrace incidents, where Jewish property persons are attacked, looted, and many Jews migrate, not necessarily abroad, but from that area into Istanbul. There's a big topic of debate, by the way, which rages between historians who are interested in this, the extent to which that state orchestrated, or whether it happened organically, or the extent to which intellectuals were hearing what was taking place in Nazi Germany and then repeating these kind of things in the press. So we'll bracket that debate, but look at the consequences. And the consequences were, again, another sign saying, even if you learn the language, even if you speak Turkish, you are not part of the Turkish nation. And then this kind of sets the scene for really what is ultimately the final kind of nail in the coffin about any possibilities about Jews being part of the Turkish nation, and that's the 1942 capital wealth tax, the Vergi affair, as it's also known. And this is when, during World War II, where Turkey was neutral but really facing a lot of economic hardship, a capital tax was levied at different businesses. The thing is, non-Muslim businesses were levied at rates considerably higher than their Muslim counterparts. Some say 5 times as many, others say as many as 12 times as much. And what this did is it destroyed the wealth of the Turkish Jewish community. In fact, I was going through, when I was researching the book, I was going through different photographs, and I came across one photograph, and the maiden name of the individual was the same as my aunt-in-law, if there is such a thing, so my wife's aunt. And it was good because we were going to Shabbat dinner with them. So, I took the photographs along with me to Shabbat dinner. And I said, "Oh, look, who is this?" And she said, "Oh, that's my grandmother." And she showed us, this picture. She said, "That's my grandmother. That house, it was such a beautiful house. It was in Edirne, which is a city in Thrace, which was once home to a large Jewish community. Now there's still the synagogue, but there's no congregants. It's mainly a museum." And she said, this was a house, but the Vergi affair, the capital tax of 1942, they had to auction off the entire contents of the home. And the memories of my aunt-in-law was that of a big, beautiful house, just bare, stripped of anything one could associate with wealth. And that very much showed what had happened to the Jewish community after this tax. And by the way, if you couldn't pay the tax, then you were sent off to a very harsh region of Turkey, not unlike Siberia, to kind of work it off in labor battalions. And that was the case until 1944. And when there's the next census that takes place in 1950, by that time, the Turkish Jewish community has gone from 85,000 down to 40,000. And over in the years that followed, it goes down to the levels that we can talk about close to today. Okay, so that's the nationalism part. Let me now jump to the Islamism part, because this is a little bit more recent, if you like. So when I say Turkish Islamism, I'm pretty sure the first person that you're going to think is Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who came to power in 2003. His party, the Justice and Development Party, came into power the year before, 2002. Erdogan was finishing his ban from politics after being imprisoned for reading a poem when he was mayor of Istanbul that delegitimized the secular nature of the state. So he comes into power in 2003. Now, it's important to note that he comes from a tradition which was in counter to many of the Turkish nationalists who followed Kemal Atatürk. And very central to his ideology, his worldview, was a type of anti-Semitism, which alleged a secret world state, a secret, nefarious, behind-the-scenes project to ensure that the great Turkish nations remains a small nation, does not actually maintain its full potential to be a great power on the world stage. In fact, that secret cabal of individuals was even plotting against the Ottoman Empire itself to enhance its demise and its ultimate collapse. This is central to the worldview of the Milli Görüş movement, the national outlook movement from which Erdogan emerged. And this is the kind of the version of political Islam, which came from Turkey and was associated with the Welfare Party, which got into power in Turkey following the 1995 elections, and after a bit of coalition politics, entered power in 1996. Necmettin Erbakan is the key figure here. And he would very much talk about the similarities between Jews and bacteria and that kind of stuff. I mean, like with the rise of the Welfare Party, there were weekly flag burnings taking place in Istanbul, and that's the Israeli flag being burnt, and all kinds of allegations of a Jewish conspiracy against the Turkish state. So it's from that political project. Necmettin Erbakan was very much Erdogan's mentor, political mentor, if you like. And by the time Erdogan comes into power, he's part of this kind of new school, which don't want to be so outwardly opposed to the secular nature of the state, but still have lots of the vestiges of that international outlook. Erdogan comes to power in 2003. Almost immediately, there is a twin suicide bombing of two synagogues in Istanbul, the Neve Shalom synagogue and another synagogue not too far away in Shishli. 22 people are killed. It is an Al-Qaeda cell that claims responsibility, but it's a homegrown Al-Qaeda cell. Now, this puts the community at a certain level of vulnerability. But to make matters worse, around the same time, especially from about 2005 onwards, you see a proliferation of anti-Semitic material present not just in pro-government newspapers or Islamist newspapers, but also on bestsellers in bookshops. We're talking about The International Jew by Henry Ford, Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They are bestsellers. You can walk into any bookshop, didn't have to be a specialist one, and it's there. Mein Kampf made it to number 4 in the bestseller list. You could get it in the airport at a cheap price. So this started to proliferate. And similar to what took place in 1927 with the Elsa Larigo affair, was the hope that was dashed among many Jews. So in the mid-2000s, there's not a large Jewish community, but there is some hope. Turkey is an EU member candidate. There is the potential of joining the European Union. There is a series of democratic reforms that's taking place. On the international level, European leaders, American leaders, Canadian leaders are talking about Turkey as being a model of democracy and an ally in the war against terror. The idea is that Turkey could potentially democratize to a significant extent to make life good in Turkey. Not just bearable, but good, a place in which your children can prosper. And you have this anti-Semitic material which is circulating in the mid-2000s. You've got attacks on synagogues as well. You've got a head of state, which is problematic to say the least. And in 2009, there's that huge bust-up between Erdogan and Shimon Peres at the Davos summit. 2010, the following year, there is a Turkish flotilla that tries to run the blockade, the Israel's blockade onto Gaza. Israeli commandos board the vessel. 9 Turks are killed in the process, a 10th if you include an American citizen of Turkish origin, and all hell breaks loose. I talked to people who were in Turkey at the time. They record a kind of a community meeting where essentially the community leaders had no answers for the Jews of Turkey, apart from keep your head down and good luck. So the idea that there could be any kind of future prosperity even with a small community, had been dashed. And to make matters worse, by 2013, there was a Gezi Park protests. And this becomes important too, because it's the final nail in the coffin of any potential for reform and democratization in Turkey. Because Gezi Park, it's a kind of a small park. Sometimes I've heard it being compared to like the Istanbul Central Park. It's certainly not that. It's considerably tiny, but it is an urban green space where you can, I guess, if you wanted to, not that many people did, take your lunch, your brown bag, and have your lunch there, then go to work after. And that was earmarked for demolition without any public consultation. And those who were protesting it were met with not just brutality, but also the rhetoric that was coming from Erdogan and some of his colleagues, calling these people who are protesting riffraff, and really kind of showing that to be a real member of the Turkish nation, to be a Turk, is to be Muslim, to be pious, to be conservative. And if you're not that, then you're not part of the nation. A kind of a further kind of a blow for the future of the Turkish community, the Jewish community in Turkey. And then from there, you have different vestiges of this further anti-Semitism, which lurks within the AKP. So, for example, in 2013, Erdogan started talking about the interest rate lobby, who are kind of masterminding the Gezi Park protests. What is the interest rate lobby? I started asking people, not in this book, but in the book that I wrote before, and it is, of course, he's referring to the Jews. When I just said the word mastermind, in 2015, a documentary came out talking about an international Jewish conspiracy against Turkey, who made a broadcast on Turkish television introducing the mastermind Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And you have this kind of proliferation of these conspiratorial anti-Semitic tropes which exist to this day. So much so that when I'm researching this book, this aging community are talking about their hopes for their children to not be in Turkey, but to be abroad. And when they think about the Jewish community and any times when it would prosper, they're looking in the past. They're no longer looking in the future. So on that kind of very positive note, I'll stop because I think I tried to time this for 30 minutes. I'm not sure if I did that or if I was a minute off, but I'd like to take any kind of questions or comments that anyone may have.
Oh, good. Simon, thank you for that and for that rich and history, getting us to where we are now and how it all started. I got a bunch of questions, and I'm sure Alex does as well. But let me start off, again, you ended on the contemporary, you gave us, the full historical element of all of this today. As you detail correctly, there's been a long history of Israeli-Turkish relations, going back to obviously, the time where, even, Sharet and Ben-Gurion were studying law in Turkey and learning about the Ottoman Empire and things of the sort that we all know and talk about. And you got into, of course, the modality of Turkey as the secular Muslim, kind of democracy that everybody was looking to. And that of course, was a major influence in Turkish-Israeli relations. And here we get to an Erdogan who is basically, a vocal, rampant anti-Semite running around for years. What kept the balance in Turkey was, of course, the military, which was, trying to maintain the modality of Ataturk. Here we are, kind of on the heels of the war with Iran, where Turkey is in the midst of developing another kind of a jihadi axis, alliance between Turkey and Qatar and Gaza and whatnot. With everything you've described, and your work there, first of all, I want to hear, a bunch of questions, but even from a logistical standpoint, were you able to get access to data, or were you prevented? Was that an issue? And secondly, no less important, from your interactions and what is there a opportunity to get back to that modality of the military maintaining the secularism, the balance that allowed for for Jewish community to thrive there, where obviously it's not happening anymore. And given with this current attitude that we're seeing today, actually, I would say that it's getting worse.
Okay, so yeah, they're great questions there, Asaf. Excellent. Okay, so when it comes to access to data, no, I didn't really have much of a problem. I didn't really find that as a kind of difficulty, not in terms of what I was looking at, because I'm looking at the history. For anything that's contemporary, when I'm in contemporary for the last 20, 30, 40 years even, then it becomes a bit difficult. And I wasn't asking any kind of difficult questions pertaining to Armenians or Greeks. So data wasn't so much of an issue there. So yes, okay. So the Turkish military for a long time, the Turkish military was a kind of a block, if you like, of Islamism in Turkey. So this causes a problem at the same time because the military interference in politics is by itself not a democratic process. And one of the things which took place, especially because of European Union reforms, was the increased decline of the military's ability to influence politics. So if you look at the different progress reports, for example, by the European Union, they would always have a section on civil-military relations, and they would note how the political elites are gaining increasing control, loosening the ties that the military has over international affairs. Now, the problem for Israel is its relationship with Turkey was based primarily on a military relationship. It was strategic in that respect. And there was economic cooperation, yes. And there was tourism and there was those kind of things, but it's primarily based on military ties at a time when the influence of the military was losing sway. This was a very, very turbulent process in Turkey. You had all these different kinds of allegations of coups that in many respects we know now were fabricated. But over the process of time, the power of the military was really decimated. After the attempted coup in 2016, I would say the power of the military to ever have any influence over politics is impossible. But here's one of the problems. When you looked at in 2016 some of the where the kind of the perpetrators or the alleged perpetrators of that coup, where they earned their stripes from, a lot of the time it was NATO. So from Turkey's position, NATO was quite problematic, and there was a period from around 2017 to about 2020 that if a Turkish military commander was sent to a post in NATO, it was really the end of their career. That was not where you wanted to be if you were a Turkish general or anyone who was up and coming. So there is that kind of complex interplay. But one thing I would say about the military is that wasn't necessarily a place that would be good for Jews, if that makes sense. Just because they're the secular guard or considered themselves the secular guardians of the state, didn't mean that these generals had a liberal, progressive conception of religious or ethnic minorities within the country. You would hear comments, you would hear voices that you wouldn't find friendly at all. One of the things that I agree with you, by the way, Asaf, and it's important to note here, the idea that Turkey was a democracy or a model democracy for other countries to follow is a complete, total Western construct. It never existed. It's never true. It was never true. During the 1920s and 30s, for much of this time, this was a single-party state. When it was a multi-party state, especially from 1950 to 1960, there was a military interference in 1960, another one in 1971, another one again in 1980, and the one in 1980 was incredibly brutal. You only have really kind of free politics from the period of around 1983 to 1996, and even then that was under the watchful eye of the military. So there's not a single generation where you say there was democracy in Turkey. So this is a complete construct. So when we think of Turkish politics, it's safer to call it a democratization process rather than ever being a democracy. And arguably, that's one of the problems that Israel has to think about and consider, the extent to which relations with non-democratic states can hold. It's always a relationship with the powerful elites. And if the elites fall, and this is a kind of a lesson for new countries that Israel is having relations with, if elites fall, then so can the bilateral relationship.
Sure. Thank you for that. I have more, but Alex, I know you have a question, so why don't you jump into it?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for a very interesting and wide-ranging presentation. Covers a lot of ground and began at a very interesting place for me personally, talking about Eli Kaduri. I'll toot my own horn. I wrote a short monograph on him and other um, Jewish historians of nationalism a million years ago. One of the points that Kaduri makes in his 1960 book and in other books, other essays about having to do with nationalism and Jews in particular, is that the Jewish communities of the Middle East, and I think one would add Turkey here, although his primary reference is Iraq and Syria, is that they just did not understand the concept of nationalism at all. That these were religious communities who had organized themselves with various organs and institutions, working under empires for literally ever. In the case of the Iraqi community, which was his own community, they'd been that way for 2,000 years in one form or another. And I think one might argue that the 20th century experience, in particular for Jewish communities, including in Turkey, is of incomprehension and playing catch up to the very idea of nationalism. But at the same time, when 1947 comes around, half the community is out of there. 30,000, 40,000, however many, moved to Israel by the early mid 1950s, and they don't look back.
Yeah.
And you know, is this applicable to the Turkish Jewish community today? Do they understand what it is that they are embedded in? Try as they do.
Excellent question, and the answer to that is yes. Today they understand. That's clear. Going back into the 1920s, no, they did not understand. They did not, and that's what one of the shocks of the El Saniego affair was. All the way back in 1927, the Jewish community in Turkey mistakenly thought they were part of it. And then they learned by the brutality of the state, because don't forget, when they were protesting, they thought they were protesting in favor of the Ataturk reforms that was going on, right? You know, they're calling for the implementation of the civic and the penal law which Kemal Ataturk had put into place, having abolished the previous one. But they found themselves then, and it was 9 community members, some of which were very prominent, in jail without bail. And that was a huge shock. And from there was a kind of realization, if you want to be Jewish, you've got to be quiet. You can live here, financially prosper, perhaps, but you've got to be quiet. There were some, by the way, who actually said, oh, okay, they bought into it. Okay, so let's just speak Turkish. Let's change our names. Let's go with it. Let's become Turks. That is the way forward, assimilating, in other words, to be part of the national fabric. Moise Cohen was one of the famous ones. He changed his name, by the way. And then later, his daughter moved to Israel. He then moved to Paris, and he wanted to open a consul general, an honorary consul general. And he was told by the Turkish authorities in the 1950s, we don't let Jews open them. So he learned the hard way. But by the time we get to today, in fact, I would say by the time we got to, before the 2000s even, it was understood that if you want to have a vibrant Jewish life, you just don't involve oneself in nationalist politics. It's not going to work.
But the difference was that the way this played out for Jews of Iraq in the 1940s was absolute, and that by the very early 1950s, exclusionary laws had been passed and they were essentially expelled. Egyptian Jews found the same situation by the beginning of the 1950s.
Yeah, yeah.
All the other Jewish communities, but the Turkish Jews managed to stay a little bit longer. I mean, Morocco, we'll leave Morocco
Yes.
aside as a
So
separate.
one of the differences here, Alec, I totally think that's a good point. One of the differences here is Turkey was never at war with Israel. In the case of Iraq, especially later on during the kind of the Ba'athist period, I mean, it was still technically at war. Same with Egypt, but by and large, it is something which I find very interesting, especially when you think of the Iraqi community, the Egyptian community, they're very much part of Arab culture when it comes to music, singers, writers. They were very much part of it, and you can extend that to the Turkish Jews as well. It is a different type of nationalism, though. It's not as aggressive in that sense, and there's push and pull factors going on. So in Turkey, it was never a case of. So the Jews were a little bit of an anomaly in that they were the loyal millet. They had fought and died with the Ottoman Empire. They were in essence loyal. So there was always this possibility that potentially they could be integrated. And plus, they were small and they weren't seen as a threat. But if you want to compare, for example, the Jews of Iraq to a community in Turkey, there are, of course, communities which were seen as being not part of the fabric whatsoever. And they were the Greek and the Armenian communities, and specifically the
Right.
Armenian community.
Is something,
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Alex.
well, I guess my question has to do with the nature of Turkish nationalism itself, which is a curious situation, something so artificial, something so arbitrary that drew on ancient, invented ancient histories for itself, um, but was very much of a modernist, had a modernist character that deeply influenced, among other things, by Italian fascism, and
Yes.
in style and organization. Um, but all these contradictions have, never made it easy for Turks themselves, much less for um, outsiders.
But it's still a clash that goes on to this day, just because these were arbitrary and never. So Turkish nationalism is not necessarily fully intellectually coherent. Not now, not to us, because not then either. And there was always these kind of there's always this inherent contradiction. So when Turkish nationalists were talking about, oh, Turkish culture, what did they mean? Well, different intellectuals interpreted that differently, and so did different officials in different places. Some considered that meant language. Others considered that meant Islam. And in the case of the kind of Islam, it's almost as if, and when I say Islam, it's a kind of a nominal Islam. They refer back to the previous situation, and that was the Ottoman period, because there's a lot of overlap intellectually. So when the Turkish Republic is talking about Turkish nationalism, it's not like this divorce from the Ottoman period. This is a debate that happened from the 20, 30 years before that was still continuing into the Republican period. And it was often unclear what is being spoken about here. What do we mean by Turkish history? Okay, we've got the Turkish history thesis, but that's still being established. That's still being discussed. It's still being codified. It hasn't been decided yet, and it's a process which keeps on changing over time. So if it sounds fickle, it's because it was fickle. It was to a certain degree incoherent. And if it's incoherent, that means that local officials and local intellectuals have to join the dots themselves. And that's what was taking place. That's why in certain parts of the empire, there were these pogroms, but not necessarily in Istanbul. right? So that's why it's uneven.
From Jacob Kohanak, he says, he asks, while interviewing members of the local Jewish community, did they practice kayadez, discreetness with you? Were they open in their opinions and responses, or did they, in your opinion, hold back?
So, yeah, by kayades, it's kind of a practice. It's a Ladino term, which means discreetness. So, you don't necessarily talk openly in public. In my case, no, they didn't hold back. And sometimes I had to kind of change the name in the book to maintain anonymity. So there was that being careful. And I've been doing research into the community for a long time. I mean, my wife is part of the community. I was kind of registered in the books of the community, so I've been part of it for a while. So the people who I spoke to knew me either personally or through a family connection, and that allowed that kayades kind of factor to not be there. However, that being said, I think any research by an outsider into the Jewish community of Turkey has to take this into consideration, that there's certain things that the community a member of the community may hold back on because of kayades, because of discreetness, this kind of discreetness which has been practiced for about 80 years now, 100 years, if you want to go back to the Arceniego affair. And that would be, oh, there's an outsider doing research about the Turkish Jewish community. That could be bad for us. Let's say what we have to say. Yes, I'm a proud Turk. Yes, I sing the national anthem with all my might. I'm fully 100% loyal and not wanting to criticize the government. And let's hope that this outside researcher will get off our back, because this could bring unwanted attention into us and can make us feel insecure. And I think anytime that there's a scholar who's doing research into the community, they have to consider that one of the answers they may receive may be influenced by that kind of mindset. And especially if it's an individual with no kind of personal contact and link with the community. So I think that's an important consideration to consider while doing research in the community. Yeah, so it's a very good question.
Thank you. That's a very, very good answer. Okay, so the next question we have here is from Eli Tendeter. Oh, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. His question is, are there any restrictions on Jews to emigrate from Turkey?
No, there are there's no restrictions whatsoever. So if you emigrate to Israel, that's fine. You do that. That's not a problem. Nowadays, after 7th October, it could be problematic if one has done IDF service or if one holds an Israeli passport. At the moment, it's not, but it's there in the background, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be an issue that's going to be very difficult for members of the Jewish community in the future. But there's no restrictions on immigration.
Good to know. Okay, so we have another question here from Mengesha Endelo, and he asks, which book of Eli Kadori inspired you, and how did that relate to your recent research?
So the thing about Eli Kadori is I think he passed away in 1992. So by the time I found him when I was about a third year undergraduate, it had been a long time. And what saddens me, I don't know if you mentioned him as well, Alex. I don't know if you find this as well, that he features less and less in undergraduate and postgraduate course material. One of the reasons is he's hard. It's not the easiest of reads, but I don't think that's good enough. And I think there's a lot of political considerations as well taking place here. But I think he is still, he should be on any Middle Eastern studies reading list. Actually, the one that inspired me, yes, Nationalism did, but also England and the Middle East. I just like the way that the arguments were made. There were different chapters, which was just so effective. It kind of, it it was in counter of a traditional wisdom that had become in place by the time I became a student. So it really challenged me in that sense. And if you're looking at the end of the Ottoman Empire and the nationalism that emerged after, England and the Middle East becomes essential reading. So does the Chatham House version becomes essential reading, and of course nationalism, which I mentioned. So do check out those works, especially if you're studying this region. That's essential.
There are a number of reasons why he's slipped from prominence that is, I think, his due. Part of it is just this is the way of the world, and he's been gone for 35 years or
Yeah.
whatever it is. And also because academia, by its very nature, works on the basis of climbing over the heads of your predecessors and intellectual betters. This is
Unless you're Edward Said, and then it becomes a staple,
right.
right?
Well, there are always
Yeah.
exceptions. His writing is hard, but it's fantastically elegant, and
Yeah,
that I think is a
yeah,
disadvantage in
yeah,
today's world. Well,
yeah.
today's students, we can't say enough about them, but well, because we want to be nice.
Well,
Um,
that would require actually reading and understanding scholarship, and to Simon's point, they should all be reading, Kaduri's article about how not to get a PhD, which
That's right.
which speaks to how Kaduri himself was ostracized as a result of his viewpoints and challenging the normative views of the day. Not to mention, but but to Alex's point is obviously was something that he maintained, and of course what Sylvia maintained throughout the journal as a result of trying to maintain that kind of pedigree that is clearly missing from today's academic zeitgeist.
Well, it's also there's a uniquely British aspect to this. He taught at the London School of Economics for his entire career, and look at look at that institution today, which is probably the epicenter of post-colonial, decolonial, anti-Western um, fervor in the British academic environment. There are other departments, Exeter or Durham, who have
Mm.
notable hostility towards Britain, towards Israel. Certainly, that's the baseline, obviously.
But that's true, Alex. But don't forget, he was teaching there at a time when um, academic debates could take place within one institution. So within the London School of Economics, one could hear Eddie Kadori, and then the following week attend a seminar, a lecture by Ernest Gellner, who they disagreed with all the time. It was a place of real academic debate and discussion that students were exposed to, one that I guess we're nostalgic for. And that took place at the London School of Economics, which was established by the Fabian Society, was a left-wing institution, and that they could accommodate someone like Elie Kadori within it. And I mean, it's very difficult because I'm always afraid of nostalgic thinking, and this is a time before I was I'm not sure if I was even alive at that time, but I kind of look back to, and I think that is the ideal.
You should have been here before the place was ruined by people like me. Is is a quote from a song.
When it all
But
went
yes, well,
downhill.
look, I started college almost 50 years ago, so believe me, it was quite different back then. But I think LSE is a very good example of how far the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction, in particular in the British intellectual, educational, social environment. I don't who sold the PhD to Saif Gaddafi? I think that might have been. I
London
think
School
that
of
might.
Economics.
That was
Saif Gaddafi
yeah,
was an
that
LT,
was
yeah.
wasn't that, yeah, that was LSC.
Um,
For
again,
a time, by the way, it was known as the Libyan School of Economics. But
Libyan
um,
School of Economics.
like selling England by the pound, as the album is called, old Genesis album. Um, what's the future for Turkish Jews? Are they will the community dwindle even further and become a kind of tiny rump like, let's say, Algeria or Tunisian?
Tunisia, yeah.
yes,
Uh,
yes.
well,
Ultimately, I think that is the future.
Simon, just keeping an eye on the clock.
Uh,
Let me add one one more point to Alex's question. Will it become a gerba? As it relates to Tunisia, and the other element then on the contemporary part, with Israel's recognition of the Armenian genocide, how does that also fit into the survival and the future of Turkey of of Turkish Jewry today?
So, one of the problems of Turkish Jewry is this inability to separate Israel from the Turkish Jewish community itself. I was talking to one. I don't want to mention the name, um, but this individual was really tired of always getting telephone calls from journalists asking to comment about developments in Israel when this was really a subject of the Jewish community, not a representative of Israel, but a representative of the Jewish community in Turkey. So this inability to differentiate the two is very problematic. One of the things that I think is going to happen with the Jewish community, certainly see it now, is that there's a certain level of protection. And there's protection because they're protected by Erdogan. To protest, for example, a synagogue is to protest Erdogan. Because Erdogan himself has promised the protection of the Jewish community because it shines a light to the world about the state of Turkish of Turkish affairs, and because he wants to have a kind of a good window dressing of what it's like in Turkey. Any kind of attacks against Jews is just bad PR for the country. So there's a certain level of protection in that sense, but it's a community which is aging. It's aging so much, it's not even talked about anymore. So I visited a kind of a community in Bursa, for example. Bursa was once home of a very large community, and it was an Orthodox synagogue. There's a kind of a place for women to go kind of in the balcony, which they don't use anymore. It's integrated because the women can't make it up the stairs. They have their minyan, they manage to have their services, but it's old and there's no one to replace it. And the youngest person is in their 50s. So that is the future of what will happen, unfortunately, in Istanbul. And you see the signs of it there. In Izmir, for example, there used to be a large community. Now the Jewish school in Izmir is closed. The Jewish school in Turkey is getting smaller in terms of numbers. In terms of community property that it owns and different foundations that it owns, it's converging, it's getting smaller. It will never disintegrate. It's always going to be there. But in terms of numbers, we're going to see 12,000, 10,000, go to 8,000, go to 6,000, even though the smaller numbers may not be declared, because it becomes a bit of an issue, by the way, in terms of minority status if the number dips too low. So yes, this is going to be an aging population, a small population, and it's very sad because it's a history which predates the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah. Simon, we could talk for more, and I'm sure we can continue offline and continue the conversation. But I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I want to thank you again for joining us this afternoon, taking the time to explain really the rich history and the from the historical to the contemporary. And of course, it's always great to dive into Kaduri, which is another voice that's missing from the discourse, and one of the reasons that we talk about these topics and an importance at Asmiya at large. It's one of the reasons that we exist, all together, following disciples like Kaduri and Lewis and Ajami, again, that are critically important to the study of the Middle East. So I want to thank you again for joining us. I want to thank my colleague Alex, as always, for joining me, and of course, my colleagues Emily and Suzanne for making all of this happen, and for everybody who joined us this afternoon. Be on the lookout for future webinars. encourage you all to go out and buy Simon's book. If you enjoyed today's talk, there's much to explore in the book itself. In the follow-up, we will send out a link, the Amazon link to his book, and so you can purchase that easily. And of course, be on the lookout for future webinars as we will be renewing the series now that we are getting into the dog days of summer and into August and into the fall. So something to look forward to. Simon, we hope you join us in Washington, at the conference in November, and we will talk soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much.
Everybody have a good day.